I want to ask you, we've been talking about China on and off for over 20 years and their imbalances. You think of the trade and tariff policy, what's going to happen? Bond yields sold off more than I expected.
Here's where we're going, where you need a very drastic reset with China. I think the rough numbers are that about a quarter of the U.S. trade deficit is bilaterally with China, but another quarter is indirectly.
We could bring, maybe using AI, some more advanced manufacturing here that was in China. Is that a real thing the next decade, to do a bunch more of it here thanks to our...
And there are ways in which AI is a quantum leap. There's a way in which it's just, a natural continuation of this, two century long process. I think
So China-US tensions are at an all-time high, especially with Trump back in office. And the question everybody wants to know is, how is this going to play out? So today we're unpacking Peter Thiel's take on US China trade, tariffs, Liberation Day, and if the US can actually reshore a lot of this manufacturing, possibly with AI or other high tech. Now, again, I'm going to be reacting to a conversation between Peter Thiel and Joe Lonsdale, both co-founders of Palantir. Before I jump into it, I'm Boardroom Wire. I do strategic breakdowns of business and technology conversations. So give me a like and a subscribe if you're into that sort of thing. But let's get started with the core issue and how decades of trade imbalance gave China the upper hand.
I want to ask you, we've been talking about China on and off for over 20 years and their imbalances. I think this week, the president declared trade war on them effectively with 125% tariffs as of now. It'll probably change in the next few days because these things keep changing. So, but it's like what do you think of the trade and tariff policy? What's going to happen? Bond yields sold off more than I expected. The yields went higher than I expected so far. Like what's going on?
So, to set the stage, what Joe's referring to is the sweeping tariffs that Trump announced on April 2nd, 2025, what he calls Liberation Day, which is effectively reciprocal trade policy or tariffs on all the countries that are tariffing the United States. So, a flat 10% tariff was slapped on all imports with elevated rates up to 50% for 57 countries accused of exploiting trade imbalances, i.e., China. So this was really sweeping policy impacting countries across Europe, Mexico, India, even, more benign allies like Singapore got hit. So nobody was spared in this. But the focus was clear. It was China. And this wasn't just economic policy, it was a statement. So the US was abandoning the purist free market approach to global trade of the past decades in favor of a more protectionist, nationalistic posture. So essentially, the era of globalization was over, and Trump just put the whole world on notice. So, as far as Wall Street goes, markets did not take this well. So, the Dow plunged nearly 10% in 2 days, one of the worst back to back declines in recent memory. And bond markets saw major whiplash too. So, yields on the Treasury dropped below 4% as investors rushed into Treasuries, a classic flight to safety. But within days, that flipped. So, yields spiked back above 4.5% as bonds sold off, signaling rising inflation expectations and deep uncertainty about where the economy was headed. Now, obviously, this conversation happened a few weeks back, and since then, we've seen how things played out. China came back to the table, and it looks like Trump's tariff gambit may have actually paid off. That said, there's still plenty of uncertainty, so let's hear what Thiel had to say about this and where things might go next.
Well, I'm hesitant to comment since obviously it's a very, very fluid situation, but something like the sort of reset they're talking about now seems where we're going, where you need a very drastic reset with China. In theory, you need a reset with other people, but what we really need to get them to do is also reset things with China. I think the rough numbers are that about a quarter of the U.S. trade deficit is bilaterally with China, but another quarter is indirectly with China.
So obviously, Thiel is a bit skeptical here to make predictions given how fluid the situation is and, frankly, how volatile Trump can be in these types of negotiations. However, Thiel's perspective aligns with a growing consensus. The U.S. needs a fundamental reset in its trade relationship with China. while the tariff discussion and strategy from Trump has been much broader than just China, I think this is sort of a shotgun approach to get that reset with China. So any concessions from other countries we have trade deficits with is just icing on the cake. Again, I think that the approach is really kind of a smokescreen, a way for Trump to obscure the actual focus on China, to avoid any retaliatory targeting and preserve negotiating leverage when it comes to discussions with them. According to the US Census Bureau, in 2024, the US and China did roughly 583 billion in direct bilateral trade. And the US trade deficit with China stood at approximately 295 billion, by far its largest with any single country. So essentially what this means is that for every $1 China spends on US goods, the US is spending $4 on Chinese goods. That's a massive imbalance in pure economic terms and is only compounded over the years. So when Thiel says they account for a quarter of our deficit and we need to fix it, it's essentially a question of how we either one, get China to spend more on US goods, or two, decrease our trade with China to reduce the gap. And that's just the direct piece, right? So another quarter of the deficit, as Thiel states, is indirectly tied to China. So what that means is when we have trade deficits with other economies, many of them are relying on Chinese manufacturing for their own exports. So think buying cars from Germany that are built with Chinese steel. On paper, it's German trade, but the money still flows to China. And when you account for both direct and indirect trade, the total trade deficit is over $1 trillion. So, of course, this is a huge economic challenge, but as we'll hear from Teal as well, it's also much deeper than that. So let's keep going and give it a listen.
Directly with China. So China is sort of half the problem, and so it's selling components that then get reassembled elsewhere, and then China is the geopolitical rival. So there's a way in which if people in Mercedes in Germany are selling cars to the U.S., we might want to have those pretty well-paying jobs in the U.S. and not in Germany. And there are all kinds of sort of mercantilist policies that at the margins Germany engages in. But it's probably not going to repurpose the Mercedes factory to build tanks to invade the U.S. or something like this.
Yeah.
Whereas this this sort of dual use problem is the problem with China. And so
this is one of the clearest breakdowns of US China tension that I've heard. So, Thiel's point here is that it's not just about trade deficits, it's also what those deficits enable. And China's not just a trading partner, it's an economic rival and a geopolitical rival of the United States. So, his example he gives here is the Germany comparison, which I actually think is pretty brilliant, but also very ironic given Germany's role in shaping the world over the last 100 years, right? So if you made that same statement in the 1940s, I think the reaction would be wildly different, but this isn't a World War II video, and the point stands today. Sure, we'd love to have the high value Mercedes manufacturing jobs that Germany has, like Thiel points out, but Germany isn't funding a military apparatus that could one day be aimed at the United States, right? And that bleeds into his point around the dual use problem with China. So China has leveraged its trade surplus into military might that poses a real threat to the hegemonic status of the United States. The United States didn't just fund cheap consumer goods, they also effectively bankrolled the rise of a serious geopolitical rival, and in the process have created a national security liability. So, in effect, the US spent 2 decades underwriting the decline of its own unipolar dominance. And that's the real issue here, right? And that's why Thiel and others keep hammering on this need for a reset with China.
Some interesting negotiations in the next few months. Do you think that we could bring, maybe using AI, some more advanced manufacturing here that was in China? Is that a real thing the next decade to do a bunch more of it here thanks to our more efficiencies and productivity?
There's probably always a decent amount of things like that. You have to you have to always be extremely granular on how expensive the robots are, how expensive the equipment is, because in some sense, manufacturing has been getting steadily more automated for 250 years. And and you've had the machines that make the machines that make the machines are getting sort of smarter and more complicated. Um, and there are ways in which AI is a quantum leap. There's a way in which it's just a natural continuation of this two century long process.
So really quickly on this point, I think it's interesting that Peter is a bit bearish on AI's impact on US manufacturing prospects. So intuitively, it seems like AI would improve manufacturing processes, automation, but that perspective has also kind of flipped over the past several years, even in the general public. So, for example, I remember 5 or 6 years ago, people would say things like AI is going to replace hard labor jobs, truckers, warehouse workers, factory lines. AI is going to replace all that stuff. Now, ironically, since the launch of ChatGPT, that narrative has done a 180. Now it's clear AI has massive applications in knowledge work and services, but not as clear if those benefits are also going to accrue within manufacturing. That being said, there's still promising developments in this same vein. So, Tesla's Optimus robots, for example, are aimed at automating repetitive tasks in high volume manufacturing and kind of the day to day lives of people. And you also have companies like Endural who are starting to lead the way in onshoring a lot of their manufacturing with projects like Arsenal One, where they built out a 5 million square foot facility in Ohio dedicated to producing autonomous defense systems. Now, they may not be using AI directly in the manufacturing process yet, but it's still interesting that AI forward companies are putting serious capital into US based production. In any case, let's wrap up and see what Teal thinks can actually be a big lift to manufacturing.
Um, I think, but yeah, I think there are some parts that can be moved to the U.S. With AI. Maybe also if you change some of the environmental rules and some of the other anti-industrial policies we have in the U.S. But then if parts of this are moved to other emerging market countries, Vietnam is, look, it's a communist country. It has bad mercantilist policies, but it's not planning to take over the world. Yeah. And so at the margins, if we can move things from China to Vietnam, that's a big win.
All right, so here Teal gives us a kind of three-part playbook on how Trump and the United States can reduce reliance on China. And honestly, I think it's a pretty strong framework for how the US could reposition itself. So first is reshoring some manufacturing with the help of AI. So there's some promise here, but it's not a silver bullet. There's potential in advanced robotics and AI driven factories, but the real world constraints still apply. So things like cost, complexity, time to scale, etc. The second is the need for a more friendly regulatory environment. So Teal doesn't go as deep here, but it's clear what he means. The US has to cut down on red tape, environmental regulations, permitting delays, zoning fights. All these things slow down the industrial progress, and China doesn't have any of those issues. The third, and I think that this is the big one, is simply shifting manufacturing to other emerging economies. So Teal brings up Vietnam as an example. It may be communist, it may be mercantilist, sure, but it's not trying to take over the world. Countries like that are going to be easier to work with and also have similar costs and manufacturing capabilities overall. Personally, I'd really add Mexico to the list. So I think Mexico could be an even stronger partner for the United States. It's close, it's cost effective, and it fits the bill for nearshoring. Of course, the Trump administration has their own challenges there, but economics have proven to be a strong olive branch in these types of situations, even when tensions are high. So at the end of the day, a diversified supply chain just makes sense, especially in the sort of post-COVID world that we live in. And I think a mix of onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring gives us resilience and overall weakens the leverage China has built up over the past 2 decades. With that, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, consider subscribing. And if you want more strategic takes on business and technology, come back to the channel. This is Boardroom Wire. See you on the next one.